Namaste. Ni hao.
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody knows that word. It's helpful. And if you want to remember it, just think of people and you say, ask somebody how it needs to be. Ni hao. Say, Zalahan. Good morning. Beautiful morning. Thank you for coming. I want to talk about Confucius. And his ethics as thinking. And this quote, this is about Jane. Why my cheese up, wood cheese up, and also this is very good. So, I'm no expert on Confucius. I came across taking this course, the great courses. I don't know if you're familiar with that series. It's DVDs that you can study on your own. They cover many different subjects, and this one happens to be on the analects of Confucius, which I found very interesting. And it's by Professor Robert Andre Lafleur. On DVD and the summary of the book here. Most of what we know about Confucius comes from this book, The Analects. He didn't write the book. It was written by his students and his students. And so they're recollections by people. It's sort of like analogous to the New Testament, the Gospels, and others. They were written later. So in the case of Confucius, the authenticity of everything is not really known. Historically, Confucius was born in 551 BCE, 525 years ago. He was before Socrates and Plato, and there's only a couple of Greek philosophers that we know about that came before him. So Confucius is sort of a philosopher. He talked about social, political ethics. That was his topic. So Confucianism in general is not religion. Although there are temples around the world, in Asia especially, most big cities have a Confucian temple. But they're monuments more than places to worship. So he came from he was born in Chufu, in the little kingdom of Lu, which is now in the province of Shantung, about 100 miles from the Yellow River. He was from a sort of a middle-class family that had a long line before him. He had a family tree that went hundreds of years before him. And his family tree goes up until today, about 67th to 68th generation after Confucius. So he probably has, his family has the best documented genealogy that's known. And you use DNA testing to find out if you're descendant of Confucius or not, apparently, because of the Y chromosome. Most of Confucius' family moved to Taiwan with the Communist Revolution. Many of the Communist leaders didn't like Confucius for the most part. But they like one idea now, that's harmony. Now they're there, they want harmony, they want any uprisings or anything, of course. There are other differences in some areas, but so Confucius' father. Confucius was about 3 when his father died, and his mother, maybe he was a teenager when his mother died. I don't know the mother sort of took care of him for a while and educated him. And he was quite self-educated. He married, had 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. He outlived his son, but the son was a student of his for a while. He also got divorced. I don't know how long the marriage lasted. I don't know why the divorce happened. But there's no quotes about him talking about marriage or divorce or women in particular. There's one maybe comment that may refer to women. He made, to paraphrase something I think I read, that, a good man, which is can be tripped up by the love of beauty. Maybe that refers to women. I'm not positive about that. But so Confucius went to work fairly early. He worked at various minor government positions. And over time, he developed a more ethical philosophy, and he was very ambitious, I think. He had a strong feeling that leaders, kings, princes, etc., should be of a high moral caliber, and that to teach people that were going to be in government, civil servants, ministers, advisors to the rulers, they need to be grounded in ethics and learn to be exemplary people. So we want to show you some Chinese characters and I'm going to try to explain them. We can start with Ren is a basic concept in Confucian ethics. You can analyze the character and get a bit of the meaning. This part is Ren itself. Apart from that just means a person or people. And the 2 parallel lines means 2. So, of course, ethics almost by definition has to be people related, but Ren is a primary characteristic, and it can be translated in various ways, but and we'll do that in a minute. So it can mean a common translation is benevolence, gentility, magnanimity, humaneness, goodness of character. So Confucius sort of believed that we were sort of born with it, but it needs developing. The development, it starts off in the family, and we'll talk more about that concept later. Familiar with piety. Let's see what comes next here. This is Li. And Li is a little harder, I think, to explain. Li originally meant doing the rites, sacrificing and doing all the rites properly. But it fell into the rules of propriety, etiquette, good form, decorum. So the person ends up needs to practice Ren with decorum, the proper form, and he needs to respect the rituals of other people. And the heart. So if you're in a grief situation, doing a grief rite, you need to go through the motions of the culture, but the most important thing was to experience the sorrow of the grief. And he maintained there was a grief period of 3 years if you lost someone close to you. When his mother died, he grieved for 3 years. I don't know if that means he didn't do much else. It sort of implies that, but one of his students, disciples, said, maybe not in context of his mother, but 3 years is a long time to grieve. Why don't we do it in 1 year? But Confucius was pretty firm that 3 years is what you need to do. So that's the practicing rules of propriety. There's a saying, and I don't think it comes from Chinese enough. You can make someone more relaxed, make a situation more informal, but saying don't stand on ceremony. Maybe it's a reference to that, but Confucius would want you to stand on ceremony. And of course, we have our candlelight ceremony and a ritual, and we have flower communion ceremony. So we have a little of that, but we're probably more informal by it. People may recognize this symbol. Confucius used this term, mostly with this particular meaning, sometimes with other meanings. But for him, Tao was the way, the ethical way, righteousness, correctness, morally. And we can contrast that a bit with Lao Tzu, who is considered the father of Taoism. Lao Tzu was a contemporary, but apparently older than Confucius. And Confucius supposedly met Lao Tzu one time and was impressed by him. But Taoism is sort of different from Confucianism as I understand it. Confucius was a very pragmatic and grounded in the here and now and the culture, the social culture, and the government, and now to make the government better. Lao Tzu was sort of a little detached, mystical, and go with the flow. Tao for him was the way of nature, and so go with nature, be natural, and not necessarily get involved with the government and institutions and rituals and stuff.
Good nature.
We'll get to that in a few minutes. Confucius referred to Tian, which is the word can be translated as heaven. And there's a question of how religious, how much did Confucius believe in the supernatural. He never disavowed the supernatural. But his students inquired, how do we deal with Tian, with God, heaven? What can you tell us about it? And Confucius, paraphrasing, said, well, we don't really understand this earth and how things operate between people. So we don't understand that. How can we understand the spirits and heaven? So his advice seemed to be, don't worry too much about that. Worry about what you can do something about. But at the same time, the rites often had to do with, they had supernatural implications. They had rights to worship the ancestors and the spirits. And Confucius did explain that you got to do the rites, and you act as if your ancestors, your deceased ancestors, were there, and if the ghosts of the spirits were there. So it's a little ambiguous exactly what he thought about. But he never developed that we know about the metaphysics about the supernatural. But he did respect it, the rituals. Okay. This is Xiao. It has two components. The upper component means older person, Lao. And the lower component means the son. So it refers to Xiao is filial conduct, of filial piety, and this is another critical concept. So there's sort of some psychology involved here. Confucius saw the family unit as he saw the whole structure of the universe as a hierarchy, moral hierarchy. It starts with the family. We sort of learn right and wrong, taught right and wrong within the family. Parents teach, or should teach, the right and wrong. The child learns to respect the parents, behave in front of the parents, show a lot of respect. I don't remember that happening with my kids so much. They think of it different these days, or letting the child have their way. And it may have sort of hammered that generation. But in Confucian thinking, the child needs to learn to be very respectful to the parent. And when you approach the parent, you have good posture and show good attention. It's like you're in the army, you're talking to the officer. Now, so this parent-child, and then, the hierarchy goes up. There's sort of the parent has a superior of some sort. So the filial relationship sort of extends upward there. And then, at some point, there's the minister, or the civil servant, and then civil service to the leader, the king, the prince. And that's sort of filial too. And again, this was a feudal system that Confucius was in, and then China had been feudal for ages. It would still remain more or less feudal for more ages. Democracy wasn't a well-developed concept, apparently, for a long time later. Even the king, the son, so hypothetically, he was responsible to the heaven, a kin, a god, and he should be respectful and do what heaven wanted him to do. So he had a mandate from heaven to be a good ruler. They were not always good rulers. Once they get in power, they don't get all they can for themselves, as we know. And Confucius implied this situation that the king is there to serve the people. And later, Confucian Mencius, who's the second most prominent Confucian, sort of made it explicit that if the king wasn't good enough, if he didn't treat the people right, he could lose the mandate of heaven. And there could be a revolution and the king could be overthrown. Now that was sort of heresy in the time of Confucius, and he didn't make it that explicit. Okay, let's see what's next. This is sort of, to me, the highlight of the talk, or the one, Jin, fourth tone. Lots of fourth tone get to how that gin comes about. The duty of the subordinate of the child, let's say, we start with, is to revere the parents and be obedient, do what they say, stay in your place, don't cause any disturbance. And one disciple asked Confucius, is this the essence? Is this more or less saying, is this it? Is this the essence of being filial? Yeah. Confucius made it clear, no, there's more to it than that. There's other duties that subordinates have. And he gave the case of the father in some family. He went out and stole sheep. And the son knew that wasn't, I don't know what the son was. The son knew that wasn't right. So what's he going to do about that? He did sort of protect or shelter the father. He didn't tell on him. But he confronted him and then said, Dad, that's not right. You shouldn't do that. But he did it very carefully, with reverence to his parent, and gently. So he doesn't have again or remonstrance. You can remonstrance as a type of confrontation. Now we bring this up to the level of the king. And the king, or the leader of, it's not, we know many cases where leaders have sort of been mean, lost their moral fiber, lost their Tao, and so that the Confucian ethic, the minister, the advisor to the king, the courtiers, that's a moral duty to set the king straight or give his opinion about what needs to be done and what needs to be wrong. So in China, there was a process, and the minister would come to the court. He would sometimes bring his coffin with him. Because who knows, if you're dealing with a tyrant, the despot, some leaders are pretty narcissistic, and some are mean people, and we would call them, in my field of psychiatry, malignant narcissists. They're benign narcissists who don't do harm to people in general, but malignant narcissists, like Saddam Hussein, he went to, as you know the story, he went to the parliament, and one of the legislators in Iraq sort of challenged him. And he said, I'm going to have this ceiling, bang, killed him. Probably not this story. This I'm sorry to tell him, but it's a risky business to confront a despot, a despotic individual. But we all probably know situations where we had to talk with a superior, and we didn't agree with superior. We didn't maybe have to, but we had the opportunity or the wish to confront a superior about their behavior, because it might be moral behavior, or it might be some other mistake, some logical mistake, or something like that. And it's not an easy thing to do. And some of the followers of the king, some of the ministers would probably know he's off base, but they wanted their jobs and they wanted their heads intact, and they would not approach the king, the leader, to confront him about the error of his ways. So to make it a pure remonstrance, you have to do it for the sake of the system and not for yourself. That's another element. Remonstrance comes, I think I said this from Latin. The remonstrance, monastery, means to show. It's sort of like demonstrate. Demonstrate is opposition or confrontation or grievance by a group of people, and that's not too hard to do in a democracy. Sometimes you get away with it in other situations. But in ancient China, the remonstrating minister would approach the king, would have an audience, he would have his scroll, he would have his complaint, his grievance written out typically. And we think this is the scroll, it's a sort of tree symbol there.
This character is true. And so the wood, which is paper, wrapped up and tied. And this left is speak. So the message, the voice, speaking, the voice, the words on the scroll, wrapped up to deliver.
So if you just give some examples of where it did work out, and the minister, the situation was that the king wanted to move about 100,000 soldiers in their households into this area, I guess, from military conquest or something. And however, this area was, they were going through a famine. And the minister could see, hey, if you don't send 200,000, 300,000 people in that area, most of them are going to starve to death. So he approached the king, and the king was pretty upset. But he was fairly persistent. The king left the room, and the minister followed him and talked about this. The minister, I'm sure, had his coffin handy. But the upshot was, in this case, the king decided to only send 50,000 households to that area. So, all right. So most of us, again, can think of situations where we had to approach a boss or superior, or where we were in a position of authority, and we were approached by a subordinate. I can think of certain ones who do that too. I don't know anybody wants to volunteer one, but I hear about those situations quite often. I also remember a situation where I had a client, a man that was in college, and he was taking like some sort of a specialty history class. That's quite long ago, but he kept, at least he thought he kept finding the teacher making errors in what he was saying, things wrong. So he repeatedly confronted this teacher in class and said, "That's not right." And I met a meeting with my client, and I said, "You need to back off. You're not going to make it. You may or may not be. You may be, even if you're right. That's not the way to do it." He could have just talked to him after class or something like that. And then the upshot was he only failed the class. I don't know where he failed it because he failed the test, or he irritated the teacher or something. But that's sort of life. Now, there is a four-character phrase in Chinese. The Chinese is named as four-character phrases, as you probably know. 中天如流. Sometimes the women's remonstrance has a good effect. The meaning of this phrase in Chinese is to follow admonition as natural flow, to accept criticism or correction, even from one's inferiors. So occasionally this worked out well, and it was a good ending to the story, and other times it didn't. So this remonstrance is, I learned an English word preparing this, because I didn't know that word, and I think all of you probably haven't known that word either. I've asked several people, I only across the road, just of 3 or 4, only one knew it. And that happened to be my daughter, incidentally. And I asked, how do you know that word? And she said, well, when I was in high school, you pressured pressuring me to build my vocabulary. So she really straightened back with me. But you know, that's a beauty of the parent, and the school system is to educate. Confucius was an educator, and he was one of the first major educators in China. And he's honored in China, very much so, for setting his precedents and getting these ethical ideas within the political system. At that time, we were still disturbed. There was mainly a matter of impressing somebody that you do stuff, or having more likely having grand sheep, the connection. And the slow jobs can be gotten by grand sheep production. Later, and originally the civil service exam was the best archer won the position. But later there were imperial examinations that you all know about. And over time, Confucian, the Analects, and the Book of Filial Piety, they were essential elements of the imperial examinations. So everybody that wanted to be an Andrea, a minister, locally, if you had a low score, but not bad, maybe you get a local position. The higher and higher your score, the higher and higher position, and you might go all the way to the emperor's court. That's another story. But this got embedded in Chinese culture, and even rulers who were educated later on, they knew all these concepts, and they must have known that they would have administrating ministers sooner or later. So maybe this helped in various ways. So there's comments about if the emperor had so many administrative ministers, he could then go right. And if you remonstrate with your friend, one person, he may change his course. But this time you have a confrontation. When you confront somebody, particularly in psychotherapy and this other situations, you put the other person on the defensive, and they feel attacked. Which they would have done, make bad result. And unstable people, they can't handle it. But part of insight therapy and psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy, there's a process. Robert Pinson wrote a great book. He was the elements of everyone on the road. But this process of confrontation, you identify a problem, if the patient hasn't admitted to this issue, you confront with it. And then you work with them, you clarify it. And then psychoanalysis, you try to connect that with a childhood event or childhood conflict, with it interpretation. And that might be the job, but typically the next stage is where you work. You go through the process again and again. Any comments, questions, or let's see. We do have a minute. Go ahead.
So it seems like Confucius, was he a philosopher? He wasn't a scientist, or he wasn't religious?
He was predominantly a philosopher. However, he had his academy, particularly in his last years of his life. He taught over 1,500 students, and he had about 70 he taught in 8th grade. But he also taught. He was a musician. He taught music. He taught poetry. He taught history. He gained a lot of his ideas from history and from these other sources. The gene and the shoe, the classics and the books, famous books. That's another story I don't know much about. So he garnered his ideas from these that is already in the culture, and he disclaimed any creativity on his part. But he edited books, and he was familiar with these books. As the children would become familiar with his writings. I think one more thing to say, if I can find it here. first lines of in the analects have to say with something to say with isn't it such a pleasure to learn and then to be able to put what you learn into effect. It is such a pleasure for friends to come from afar to visit. And the third line, I want to read that, but I lost my page. So I will stop here. And we have experts here on the subject. If anybody want to make comment on it. Where's my paper? There, do you have any comments on it?
Yeah, I thought you did a very beautiful job with your presentation.